They say it's about freedom. We should have the right to decide how to run our own businesses. The government doesn't know how to run my business. And so the other piece of the story is an argument about government inefficiency. How could the government possibly think that they know better than me how to run my own business? And so they begin to develop this argument about efficiency and about freedom, and to say that the government should not intervene in the marketplace because that threatens initially economic freedom, but then they begin to make the argument that once you give up economic freedom, it's only a matter of time before you begin to lose your other freedoms as well.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic label distinguishing food grown in healthy soil and animals raised on pasture, all without synthetic fertilizers or toxic chemicals. You just heard from Naomi Oreskes, historian of science at Harvard University and author of Merchants of Doubt. She has spent her career uncovering how corporations and specific individuals manipulate science to sow confusion and delay action in order to serve their personal ideologies and pocketbooks. Naomi sat down with Dave last month to shine a light on the ways that the same disinformation threatens the future of real organic farming and climate action.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm really pleased today to be talking to Naomi Oreskes. Naomi, it's been a long time. We were friends long ago, and you moved on here, there, and everywhere. So now you're at Harvard. You're an historian of science, and you wrote a number of books, but two that I'm very familiar with. And one was Merchants of Doubt, and one was The Big Myth. And they have bigger titles. But Merchants of Doubt, how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to climate change. And The Big Myth, how American business taught us to loathe government and love the free market. So these are both very relevant to the work of the Real Organic Project. And thank you for taking the time. Thank you for writing the books. I'd like to just unpack a little bit about Merchants of Doubt. Could you just talk a little bit about the themes? What drew you to that book? What was your goal there?
So as you said, I'm a historian of science, and one of the things I'm interested in is why people sometimes accept scientific information and sometimes they don't. And so quite a few years ago, more than 20 years ago, I got interested in a group of scientists who were denying the reality of climate change. And I thought that was pretty weird. They were fairly famous scientists. They were clearly highly intelligent people. One was a former president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. So it clearly wasn't a case of scientific illiteracy or lack of education. And so I got interested in why would prominent scientists deny the hard-won findings of their own colleagues. And what I discovered, along with my colleague Eric Conway, my co-author, was this really astonishing and frankly depressing story about it's a kind of serial contrarianism, that these people who denied climate change had also denied the scientific evidence of acid rain. They had denied the scientific evidence of the harms of DDT, so pesticides. They had denied the scientific evidence of the ozone hole. And the real kicker, this whole story began for them working with the tobacco industry, denying the scientific evidence of the harms of tobacco.
Same people.
Same people. Same people, same strategies. And so we thought, okay, something is going on here and it's not normal science. And so as historians of science, we recognized that this was something different and we wanted to know what it was.
And what did you discover? I mean, it's like a detective mystery, right?
I know some of my friends always said it should be the romance, or who done it. So it's a kind of why did they do it? So what we really found was a story about politics and a story about political ideology. That these men, and they were all men, came out of the Cold War with a very strongly anti-communist political orientation. And they believed, rightly or wrongly, I would say wrongly, but they believed, I think authentically, that government regulation of the marketplace was a slippery slope to socialism and communism. And that if you allowed the government to regulate dangers, smoking, pesticides, that pretty soon the government would take over your whole life. So it's a kind of quasi-libertarian argument about just letting the free market sort things out. And because they felt this so strongly, they felt justified in making common cause with the tobacco industry, making common cause with the pesticide industry, and challenging the scientific evidence. So my position has always been, we could disagree about what the solutions to these problems are, and I think people of good faith can. What they did that to me was a bad faith move was not to say, I'm against government regulation because I fear what it leads to. What they did was to say, I don't believe the science. And by making that move, by attacking the science, denying the science, they opened up this world of hurt that we now live in, where people deny the science about all kinds of things, including organic food, the harms of pesticides, the safety of vaccines, the contagiousness of COVID-19. There's sort of no end now to where we see this kind of mischief taking place.
Okay, and so we stepped into the big myth
Already, right.
which is great.
Right.
But just to go back for a minute
Yeah.
to Merchants of Doubt, that title is. Did you come up with that title?
Well, it's funny. I wish I could say that we did. It was an unnamed person in the marketing department at Bloomsbury Press, and I've always felt guilty because sometimes people compliment me on what a great title it was.
It's a great title.
And the only thing I can say is we had a bunch of working titles: fighting facts, challenging knowledge. We had played around, but never really settled on a title that seemed right. And one day my editor called and said, well, someone in the marketing department suggested Merchants of Doubt. What do you think about that? And to my credit, I did say, oh my God, that's perfect. That's it. So Thank you, whoever that was, someone in the marketing department. But it comes out of a line in the book. So there's a famous memo, we could say infamous memo, that's been quoted a lot. A tobacco industry executive back in the 1960s says, doubt is our product because it's the best way of convincing people to ignore the science. So if you could you don't have to prove tobacco is safe, you just have to raise doubt about the science. And if people aren't sure, they'll keep on smoking. So this is a very famous memo, and in the book we discuss this memo and we say, so in effect they were selling doubt. And so that's where the idea of Merchants of Doubt came from.
No, it's a brilliant title because it's so meaty. I mean, there's a lot there. It's interesting. I have thought about the things that we're dealing with, that we're often dealing with merchants of confusion. That they're just saying, yeah, this is complicated, but what about this and what about that? But they're very similar. But I like Merchants of Doubt.
Well, there are two sides of the same coin, really. I mean, part of the whole point is you want people to doubt the science, and you want people to be confused, because their own research, and the tobacco industry did market research on this, they found that if people were confused, confusion favors the status quo. Yeah. If people are confused, they just say, oh, it's too confusing, I don't know what to do, I'm just going to keep eating my hamburgers. Or it's too confusing, the science is unsettled, I'll just keep smoking until the science is sorted out. And so these people know it's really weaponizing confusion, weaponizing doubt to protect their interests, maintain the status quo, and keep people smoking or driving big cars or whatever it is.
And were the tobacco companies actually confused themselves?
Absolutely not. I mean, the power of this whole story, and I think the power of the book, is that we show without any doubt whatsoever that they absolutely knew. And the evidence for that is overwhelming. And in fact, it's why the tobacco industry has now paid billions of dollars in fines and settlements, because they knew perfectly well. They knew since the 1950s that their product was deadly. They knew that it was addictive. And not only did they lie about the fact that it was deadly and addictive, they even worked to make it more addictive than it already was to keep smokers addicted to a deadly product.
Yeah. What was the government's role in all this?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the government's role has changed over time. But the key part of the government's role in this, particularly if we look at the early story about tobacco, was that the government played a very important role initially in publicizing this information. So when it became really indisputable that smoking caused cancer and other deadly diseases, the U.S. Surgeon General played a very important role in the famous Surgeon General's report that many of us have heard of, in which the Surgeon General used the authority of his office as the nation's chief doctor to say, yes, this product will make you sick, yes, this product will kill you. And that was very important because the Surgeon General was viewed as independent, objective, and minding the health of the nation. And so there were a couple of Surgeon General's report in the 1960s. Those really helped shift the public conversation. And it also empowered states and local governments that were beginning to pass restrictions on smoking, say in public places. It helped to empower the FAA to ban smoking on airplanes. And then ultimately it helped empower Congress to act on tobacco and to require warnings on cigarette packages. Now, could the government have done more? Well, I mean, I have colleagues who think that tobacco should have been abolished, that it should have been banned. But the government did a lot, and the government played an important role in helping educate people and helping implement tobacco control. Government also played a really important role in the legal domain, and this comes a little bit later. So the Surgeon General's reports in the mid-60s takes a little while, but then state attorneys filed lawsuits against the tobacco industry on the basis of exactly what we've just been discussing, that they knew that this product was deadly, they lied about it, they participated in false and deceptive advertising, and the states were left with billions of dollars in medical costs. And so the state attorneys' lawsuits against the tobacco industry were really a game changer in terms of really identifying this industry as the bad actors that they were, and really ending the doubt campaign, really showing the American people that we'd been lied to, that tobacco was killing us. And so today, I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, about 75% of all Americans smoked. Today it's only about 25%. So millions of lives have been saved, billions of dollars in health costs have been saved because state attorneys, in their role as government officials, sued this industry for what it had done.
Yeah. Okay, well, that would be government operating as we would hope government would operate.
Correct.
Right,
And
to protect the citizens.
Right, and it's one of the reasons this is such an important story, because our government does protect us. Our government does what we needed it to do. And there's also one more piece, which is the federal prosecution of the tobacco industry. So also in the 1990s, the federal government, the Department of Justice, led by a lawyer, Sharon Eubanks, brought a lawsuit against the industry under the RICO statutes, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization. And this was super important because it really exposed the tobacco industry as the corrupt organization that it was. And the documentation that came out of that case actually played a very large role in our being able to write our book, because so much of the proof about what happened came out of these lawsuits.
Okay. So yeah, being able to see behind the curtain is a huge part of all this.
Exactly.
Well, before we go to the big myth, I guess we better talk about climate change, because that was a big part also of Merchants of Doubt. Tell us about the playbook there. How did the industry use doubt, sowing the seeds of doubt, in order to postpone or completely avoid any kind of government regulation to change something that was a pretty big deal?
The playbook is exactly the same, and that's really what led to us writing a book about it. So at the time, going back to the mid-2000s, this is 20 years ago, I was working on climate change, but mostly working on it as a historian of science. So I was studying the history of climate science. I was trying to understand how scientists had sorted out what was going on, and when scientists had said, yes, the climate is really changing. And so I published a paper in 2004, and this was at a time that many people were still claiming there was no scientific consensus on the issue. President of the United States had said there was no consensus. The Vice President of the United States had said there was no consensus. And so there were several times when I wanted to throw a shoe at the television, but instead of doing that, I did research to try to answer that question. Well, is there a consensus? And if so, when did that consensus develop? I published a paper in 2004 based on that research, in which I said, yes, there is a consensus, virtually unanimous among experts, and that consensus has been in place since about the early to mid-1990s. I published that paper naively thinking that journalists and politicians were just confused, and that if I would just explain it clearly and patiently and in a non-condescending way, people would say, oh, good to know. Well, I was very naive. When that paper was published, I started getting attacked. I got hate mail, threatening phone calls. People filed complaints with my university, claiming that I must have been a fraudulent historian because obviously people could see there was a big debate. So if I couldn't see that debate, then I must be an idiot. And I was attacked, denounced on the floor of the U.S. Congress by Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma. So that was what I call my Alice through the looking glass moment, when my whole world turned upside down. I had been working under a premise that I thought many of us were raised with, especially those of us who went to science, which was that if you figure out the facts and you explain them clearly and you publish them in reputable journals, people will accept those facts and they'll act on them. Well, that might have been true once upon a time, but it's sure not true now. So I started getting attacked, and it was the attack that led me to try to figure out what was actually going on, because this was clearly not a scientific debate. It was some kind of political or cultural debate. And then the sort of piece of luck part of this story was that I met Eric Conway at a conference. Eric is also a historian of science. He was working on a book on the history of atmospheric science, and a big part of his book was this ozone story, the story of how scientists had realized that this particular group of chemicals, the so-called chlorinated fluorocarbons, or CFCs, that they had the potential to destroy stratospheric ozone, which protects us from UV light. And without stratospheric ozone, we would be frying to a crisp at this very moment. So Eric had been doing this work. He had come across a lot of information about attacks on those scientists, but he hadn't done anything with it. He hadn't published it. But when I started telling a group of colleagues about what was happening to me, he made the connection. He said, well, the people that are attacking you are the same people who attacked the scientists who worked on the ozone hole.
The same people.
The same people.
The same people who are defending tobacco companies
well, we didn't
20 years earlier.
We didn't know that part
yet. You didn't know that
We didn't
yet.
know that yet. So right now, at this point, we just had 2 points on the line. We had climate and we had ozone, and that seemed a little weird, but it didn't seem catastrophically weird because, you know, ozone is atmospheric chemistry, climate is atmospheric physics. They're related. It was plausible that the same scientists could be involved in both those debates. It felt a little weird, but it didn't seem totally crazy. But this group of scientists were very famous people, and I recognized their names, including a man who had been my colleague at Dartmouth College, Robert Jastrow. Jastrow was an astronomer. He had written a bunch of popular books about astronomy, and he really didn't know anything about climate change, so it seemed weird that he was involved in this debate. And then another one was a man by the name of Fred Seitz, a solid-state physicist, who had been the president of the National Academy of Sciences in the 1960s. And that seemed pretty weird, too.
A towering figure.
A towering figure, right. A really, really big figure in American science. And I just thought, why would someone like Fred Seitz question the scientific evidence of climate change or the evidence of the ozone hole? And so I started digging, and that's when I found the tobacco connection. It didn't take very long to find out that Fred Seitz, and also a fourth fellow in this story, Fred Singer, had worked for the tobacco industry. And they had used the exact same arguments they were now using to question climate science, they had used to question tobacco science. And that's when I picked up the phone and called Eric, who I scarcely knew. I'd met him once at a conference. I said, I think we should write about this together.
That's great.
Yeah.
And you said he sent you quite a stack of research he had already done.
Well, materials he'd collected. He hadn't written anything about it because he was writing a book about the science, and this seemed to be the politics. So he had sort of done what I think a lot of us were taught to do, which was to think that the science and the politics were separate. And the realization we had was, oh no, they really weren't separate, that this was a really interlocked story about scientific discovery triggering political opposition. And that was really the story that unified these different cases, ozone, climate, tobacco, pesticides, that in all these cases, the science was telling us these products are doing real harm and the government should do something about it. But of course, the manufacturers didn't want that to happen.
It's really interesting to me, Naomi, that your understanding is that primarily they were motivated not by personal gain, but by politics, by their sense of democracy as a bulwark against communism, and that we needed to defend the American way by defending a freedom of choice in which government does nothing.
Exactly. And I think it's a little easier to make that argument today, given what is going on in Washington, D.C. right now. But 20 years ago, when we first started making this argument, people were very skeptical. I think a lot of people just assumed that this was a story of money, as you said, that it was about personal gain. And I think a lot of people found it hard to believe that people would go to such lengths to, attacking science over political ideology. I mean, now I think we see it because we see, how divided this country has become over ideological questions, even to the point that many people are arguing positions that don't actually seem to advance their economic interest. And so I feel like one of the important lessons of this story is you cannot reduce everything to money. I mean, money is definitely part of this story, and there's no question that money was the driver for the companies themselves. I mean, the tobacco industry, I don't think they gave a hoot about democracy. They cared about profits, but they make common cause with people who do have these strongly held political views. And it's that common cause that I think made this so powerful and so toxic, right? Because now you have the power and the money of the tobacco industry linked to an ideological argument that seems to be in some ways virtuous, right? Because who among us doesn't believe in freedom? And who among us wouldn't say that ceteris paribus, we ought to be able to decide for ourselves how to live our lives? And in fact, something I've often said in public that sometimes upsets my public health friends, I mean, I feel like in a perfect world, if using tobacco didn't hurt other people, then as far as I'm concerned, if someone wants to smoke, and if they know
if they get the truth,
if they have the truth about the risks, then, it's really not for me to tell them whether they should smoke or not. But the problem with that set of ifs is, A, they didn't have the truth because the industry lied to us about it, and B, when you smoke, it does hurt other people. Because one of the things we learned, and the things that the industry fought the hardest to deny, was that when I smoke, it puts you at risk as well. When I smoke, it puts my children, my partner, my bartender, my flight attendant at risk. And that, I think, to me, this is the core failure, the Achilles heel of all libertarian and libertarian leading philosophies. It's fine to say we should all get to decide for ourselves how to live our lives. Sure, that's a great idea in principle. But the reality is we're all interconnected. When I smoke, it does affect people. When I drive a car or fly on an airplane, those greenhouse gas emissions go into the atmosphere affect us all. When I use pesticides, I could say, I don't mind if my green peppers have pesticide residues. That's a risk I'm willing to take. Well, okay, but those pesticide residues end up in a river that goes downstream, affects plants, affects birds, affects all the people who live downstream, goes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and affects the aquatic ecosystems. Everything we do is interconnected. That's the whole lesson of ecology. And so the idea that I can just decide for myself, that's an idea that really doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny. And that's why I think the right wing in this country, the libertarians, have so turned against science. Because science proves that their idea, it may sound good in principle, but it never works in practice.
Oh, that's really good. That's very clear. Okay, I'm almost ready for the big myth, but there's one more.
It's okay.
There's one more.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, you know who E. Bruce Harrison is?
Sounds familiar, but...
The father of greenwashing, he's been called.
Oh, okay, yes, I have heard of him, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
He was a real glad-hander and a charming person. And he was actually, as a young man, he was involved in the campaign to demonize Rachel Carson.
That's where I've come across it, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And they took on Rachel Carson, they took on Ralph Nader, and they destroyed Ralph Nader. But they failed with Rachel Carson. They tried to destroy her. They said, well, she never finished her PhD. She's not really a scientist, and we're pretty sure she's a lesbian, and all these other things, right? We shouldn't listen to her.
Yeah.
And it didn't work.
Yes. Well, I think the main reason it didn't work is because frankly she died.
Yes.
I mean, she died rather soon, only a few years after running Silent Spring. And although it's not impossible to demonize a dead person, and indeed in the 1990s there was a second wave of anti-Rachel Carson activity that we actually write about in Merchants of Doubt, where they did, posthumously demonize her. But I think the fact that she died, and she died of breast cancer, and of course there was already evidence at that time that DDT caused cancer, I think that made it a little bit harder for her. But also the other important part of this story, again, it gets back to the government. One of the crucial reasons why Rachel Carson's work had the impact it did, part of it was that she was a beautiful writer. Silent Spring is an amazingly beautifully written book. So even though it's a negative message, it's written in a very beautiful and positive way. And I think that was really super important. It's a beautiful book to read. People wanted to read it and people enjoyed reading it, even though it's a sad story. But also she was defended by the federal government. So John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy at the time, asked his Science Advisory Committee, the President's Science Advisory Committee, to review the scientific evidence and to give an objective appraisal of whether or not her reading of the science was correct. And they said, yes, absolutely. And that was made rather public in the mid-60s, and it was part of what led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And one of the very first actions that EPA took in the early 1970s was to ban the use of DDT in the United States. So it wasn't just that Carson did this very important piece of work in writing, but she was defended by the President of the United States and his top scientific advisors. And so it's similar to the Surgeon General story, having the argument validated by a high-level government official, an official who represents the interests of the American people. That's a very powerful combination. And Carson had that in a way that many of us don't have today.
Yeah, that's right. The next step of that is that Harrison came up with a different strategy for climate change. And it actually wasn't one of doubt. It was saying they're right. So he was representing the oil companies, and he said, you need to go to Rio in 92,
Right.
91,
Yep,
92.
Yep.
And you need to say
Right.
the truth, which you know the truth, which is that climate change is real. It's
Right.
caused by burning of fossil fuels, and say voluntarily, we're going to fix this.
Right.
And so it was interesting because they weren't saying, well, we're not quite sure about this. They said, we got to cut it off at the pass. Are you aware, have you thought about that strategy that they used? And I've heard it said that it set back the climate movement by a generation.
Well, I think lots of things set back the climate movement, because one of the things we've shown in our work is that the industry is very clever and they work on multiple fronts. And often they will try as many different things as they can, and they'll see what works. And sometimes they'll do one thing for a little while until it stops working, and then they'll do something else. So we've seen the fossil fuel industry pursue all these different strategies. There have been times when they absolutely denied that climate change was happening. There have been times when they said it was real, but it wasn't caused by their products, that it was just natural variability. There have been times when they said, well, it is real, and it is caused by fossil fuels and deforestation, but it would be too expensive to fix. So we've seen all these different strategies, and one of the strategies is greenwashing. And so as you said, greenwashing begins early in this campaign. We see it from very early periods. We're going to make a good faith effort. We're going to be partners. We're going to work together with government and the public to fix this. But while they're saying that, it's the old magician's trick, right? They're over here. This is the ribbon. This is the hoop. We're great. We're committed to fixing this. But over here, they're funding climate denial organizations. They're funding lobbying to prevent action. So what we know about that early period around the Earth Summit at Rio in 1992 is that many of the corporations did say they were committed to being good partners, but they begin to fund a group called the Global Climate Coalition, whose express purpose is to stop the United States from ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, which was the protocol to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was going to create binding emissions limits. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was passed in 1992, is a statement of principle, but there's no enforcement mechanism, there's no emissions limits. The Kyoto Protocol was the piece that was going to say, okay, and now that we've agreed to that, here are the binding limits. And the Global Climate Coalition, funded by the fossil fuel industry, stopped that from happening.
Yeah. Which is an example. Bill McKibben, when I interviewed him, said, I thought we were having an argument, a debate.
Right, exactly.
And
right.
It turned out that we were just having a fight.
Yeah, well, and lots of scientists have said that too. Lots of scientists I spoke to in that early period when some of the fossil fuel companies were saying, well, we don't really know, we think we need more to do more research. The scientists thought they were having a scientific debate. So if they just did more research, if they answered some of these key questions, and often the questions weren't illegitimate. So how do we know it's not cloud feedbacks? How do we know it's not this or that? They were legitimate questions, but the scientists thought if they answered them, then it would all be settled. But what they found instead was for every question they answered, the fossil fuel industry would come up with another and another and another. One admiral I know said it's kind of like a game of fetch. You know, the climate deniers would throw a bone and say, fetch! And then the scientists would scramble running after the bone and they would get it and they'd trot back saying, okay, here it is, we got the answer. And then the industry would say, oh, but what about volcanoes? Fetch! And then the scientists would go running off again. And we've seen that over and over and over again with various different claims about cloud feedbacks, about volcanoes, the claim that global warming stopped, which was never true. But scientists, sadly, often fall for it because scientists want to do science.
Yeah.
And scientists want to believe that people are negotiating in good faith. And scientists want to answer questions. I like to answer questions. I mean, early on, there was a period when I had my whole notes prepared with how do we know it's not volcanoes? I mean, all these things I was always ready to answer. And it's not that we shouldn't answer those questions. Of course we should. And sometimes you could meet a person, you know, in Nebraska, in North Carolina, in California, wherever. And for that person, it might be a good faith question because maybe they heard it somewhere and now they're thinking, oh yeah, how do we know? But they didn't get it from a good faith source. They got it from a climate denial website or they got it from ExxonMobil. And so now you're in this tricky situation where you really do need to answer the good faith questions that people are posing. But the reason it's in circulation in the first place is not because of a good faith conversation. It's because of disinformation promoted by the fossil fuel industry.
Right. And we could define disinformation as being putting out information that they know is wrong.
Correct. Correct.
They know it's wrong.
Right. My mnemonic on that is disinformation is deceitful. It's dishonest. Yeah, all those good D words, right? As opposed to misinformation, which could just be a mistake. I mean, often people are confused, and that's understandable because it's a confusing issue. And so in my own work, I always really try to be super sympathetic to people who are confused. It's not our fault we're confused.
That's
people
right.
have been trying to confuse us. But when it comes to people who are deliberately promoting disinformation that they know is wrong, then I have a lot less empathy for that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I think it's time for the big myth.
Okay.
So your last book,
Yes.
How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. So it's a natural continuation of the conversation, but I think it's going very deep into what's really going on here. So what is the big myth?
Well, the big myth is what Ronald Reagan used to like to call the magic of the marketplace. The idea that markets have wisdom, that markets are intelligent, that the market is guided by an invisible hand, and it all works out. And so all we have to do is step back, don't interfere, and particularly make sure the government doesn't interfere, and we'll get optimal outcomes for all the things that we're concerned about. So that's the big myth, the myth that we can just trust the free market to do the job we need it to do, and we don't need government regulation, government action in the marketplace.
And what's wrong with that?
It's not true.
Okay.
I mean, we have 2,000 years of history to show us that it's not true, and it's not true on multiple levels. So in the most basic kind of historical rudimentary sense, we have had markets for as long as we know. I mean, historical records show there were markets in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Pompeii. One of my favorite things I saw in Pompeii was a shop where you could see the wood had been carved out where people had collected their coins. So people have been doing business, buying and selling stuff since time immemorial. And guess what? They have had rules about how markets should operate. since time immemorial, because the reality is there's no such thing as the free market. Markets are people exchanging stuff, buying and selling in the marketplace. And sometimes people lie, sometimes people cheat, sometimes people accidentally put stones in the bag of potatoes. And so you can find rules for how markets should operate in the Old Testament, in Leviticus. So the basic idea that markets could operate without rules has no historical foundation. So it's historically false. But it's also untrue if we look at the history of capitalism. So if we just now fast forward to the period that we would identify as capitalist, say, since the late 18th century or so, even if we just look at that period of time, we see what economists call market failure. That markets left to their own devices don't actually always give us good results. And one of the most articulate people on this issue is Adam Smith. And my favorite part of the book is actually our discussion of Adam Smith, because a lot of people think that Adam Smith was this advocate of absolutely unregulated, untrammeled free markets. And the right wing in this country, the libertarians, the Wall Street Journal, promote this idea that that's what Adam Smith believed. But it's not true. If you actually read The Wealth of Nations, you see that Adam Smith says, well, actually, banks need to be regulated. You cannot trust the self-interest of bankers, because bankers will lend all this money, they'll offer cheap credit, and guess what? The whole economy could collapse. Well, that was kind of a cool thing to read after the 2008 housing collapse in the United States, and I was rereading it right around the time of the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. So Adam Smith recognized, 1776, so more than 250 years ago, that you have to regulate banks. And he gives the analogy of firewalls. He says, look, we have firewalls. We don't just let people build any old building, because we know if a fire breaks out in one house, it will quickly spread to the house next door. In fact, this is what had happened in the Great Fire of London. So you have to have regulations to make sure that you build firewalls between buildings. And he says the regulations of banking that I'm proposing, me, Adam Smith, is exactly the same as firewalls.
Yeah. Okay. He also had a lot to say about monopoly.
Exactly, right.
Yeah, could you talk about that?
Right, so-
I actually love this conversation.
Thank you, I know. Well, me too. I mean, one of the paradoxes of capitalism is that capitalism is based on the idea of competition, that the marketplace works well when we have competition, because if you sell crappy bread, then I'm not going to buy your crappy bread if there's another baker down the road that has better bread, or maybe the same bread but at a better price. So the whole notion of supply and demand, of markets responding to people's needs, depends on competition. If you're the only banker in town, or you're the only baker in town, then I'm kind of stuck, and you can sell me a product that's as bad as you like, and I'm stuck because I don't have anywhere else to go. And one of the problems with modern capitalism is that very often it becomes monopolistic. And this, by the end of the 19th century, had become clear as a very major problem, particularly here in the United States, with the rise of railroad monopolies, electricity monopolies, steel monopolies. And so in the United States, we passed laws to prevent monopolistic practices. And the most important was the Sherman Antitrust Act, followed a little bit later by the Clayton Antitrust Act, because people saw with their own eyes that you couldn't just let the free market operate, because the free market pretty soon became very unfree because of the risk of monopolies. And so we've known since the 18th century that we needed banking regulation. We've known since the 19th century that we needed regulations to prevent monopolistic practices. And in the 20th century, a whole set of other things became clear. And this is what the new book begins with. It begins with child labor. Yeah. Because the other thing that happens is if you let business people, and in those days it was almost all businessmen, so we'll say businessmen, but it could be business people. If you let business people just operate however they want to, they will cut corners, they will do whatever they can do to reduce prices and increase profits. And that's been shown time and time and time again. And in the early 20th century, both in the United States and in Europe, child labor was very widespread. Here in Massachusetts, there were children as young as 2 years old working in textile mills. And these children, half of them died before the age of 21. And so a movement began to develop both in Europe and in the United States, but our book focuses mostly on the US because that's where we are, to ban child labor. And the business community began to fight back. And so what we show in the new book is that we see the beginnings of this argument about freedom and free markets actually not in the 1950s with debates over tobacco, but actually in the 1900s, in the early 1900s over child labor and also workmen's compensation. So children are dying in factories, children are dying in mines, children are dying in textile mills, and all across the country workers are dying on the railroads, in mines and mills. And in those days, if a worker died, if a worker was killed, that person's family is left with nothing. And so many women and children were destituted by the death of the male breadwinner. Particularly railroads were exceptionally dangerous. So a movement develops to try to ban or limit child labor. A movement develops to develop a workmen's compensation scheme. And these movements are successful. So many states begin to pass laws. The federal government passes a workmen's compensation system, which today we totally take for granted.
Right.
But the business community begins to fight back. So how do they fight back? Do they say, oh, we think it's good that we kill our workers? No, of course they don't say that. Do they say, yeah, we think it's right that 2-year-old children are being trapped in looms in Lowell, Massachusetts? No, they don't say that. They say it's about freedom. We should have the right to decide how to run our own businesses. The government doesn't know how to run my business. And so the other piece of the story is an argument about government inefficiency. How could the government possibly think that they know better than me how to run my own business? And so they begin to develop this argument about efficiency and about freedom, and to say that the government should not intervene in the marketplace because that threatens initially economic freedom, but then they begin to make the argument that once you give up economic freedom, it's only a matter of time before you begin to lose your other freedoms as well. And so this is where, so we argue in the new book that this is where this political argument about defending the free market, opposing regulation, really finds its original roots.
Yeah. That's a very compelling thing to say, that the only way that we can maintain our personal freedom, our democracy, is by this unregulated marketplace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You talked about workers' compensation, but there's also OSHA. And,
well, that comes later.
And
right.
protecting workers' safety,
right.
so that they don't
right.
need to have a
right.
widow who
right.
who doesn't know what to do.
Right.
How that comes in the 30s?
Yeah. So what happens is, I mean, this is a long story. It plays out over a long period of time, and it's not really until the Great Depression that things really begin to change in a big way. I mean, they started changing a number of states passed child labor laws, but the Great Depression really changes the whole conversation, because part of the argument that business leaders in this country make is that America is a very prosperous country. Look at all these things that Americans have. We're the envy of the world. We have more electricity. We have more stuff. Ford is making Model T Fords. And this prosperity comes from freedom, and it comes from the free market. And up until 1929, that argument seems kind of plausible to a lot of people. And then you get the crash in the Great Depression, and all of a sudden that argument doesn't seem so plausible. Suddenly the business community that has been telling us that they're delivering all this prosperity, and the price of that prosperity might be, a few workers killed here and there, although it's a whole lot more than a few. But suddenly that whole argument really doesn't seem to hold water. And so the American people become much more sympathetic to the idea that the federal government needs to play a big role in the economy. And so FDR is elected in 1932, and immediately he begins to make a lot of changes. More regulation of banks, regulations of securities to prevent securities fraud, which had played a pretty big role in the crash. Finally, in 1938, after decades of arguing, we finally get a law to limit most forms of child labor. Workmen's compensation had already been put in place, but other protections for workers, minimum wage, limited 40-hour work week. So a whole set of stuff that really does change America in a really big way and makes America a much safer place for workers, a much safer place for children, and also Social Security. Because part of the reason workmen's compensation had been such a big issue was that if a factory worker is killed, his family's left with nothing because there was no workman's compensation. There was also no Social Security. So Social Security ensures that families are not left destitute. And so I would say, and in the book we argue, that from about 1932 till about 1980, there's a broad consensus in American culture that government does have to play a significant role in the economy, that governments do have to protect workers and children. But then it begins to change with these environmental questions. And we can get into that more, but the sort of short answer to the answer, so why does it change? So the business community has been a little bit divided on this issue. During the Great Depression and the New Deal, there are portions of the business community that agree that, yeah, things have to change. And there are certainly portions of the business community that support banking regulation, that support limits on child labor, but there are others who don't and who continue to push back against it. And so in the book, we follow those ones who continue to push back. And one of the things that those folks do is they cultivate and develop Ronald Reagan. And so Ronald Reagan then, in the late 70s, becomes the standard bearer of this argument that government intervention in the marketplace is a bad thing. And up until now, that argument has not really gained traction. But in the 1970s, the American economy starts to sputter. We have the Arab oil embargo, price of oil skyrockets. Some people may remember waiting online to buy gas. We have stagflation. The economy is stagnant, but we still have high inflation. And this combination of economic problems creates this opening for Reagan to say, well, we know what the cause of that is. The reason the economy is stagnating is overregulation. And what we need to do is to dial back government regulation.
And actually, that's where we are now.
And that's where we are today, 40 years later.
Yeah.
And a big part of this argument has to do with the environment. So by the 1960s and 70s, most people, including most conservatives, have accepted that, yeah, child labor was not that great a thing. And most people have accepted that workman's compensation makes sense and it's fair. But what they don't like is the rise of environmental protection. And this is the other big piece about capitalism that we have to talk about. So we've already talked about market failure in terms of bank regulation. But the other really big piece where capitalism fails us is what economists call external costs. And the textbook example of an external cost is pollution. So imagine I have a shoe factory. I'm manufacturing shoes, and my shoes are good shoes, and I sell them at a fair price, and you buy them because they're good shoes. But what you don't know is that when I'm making those shoes or maybe tanning that leather, I'm using toxic chemicals that I'm dumping in the river behind my factory. And those toxic chemicals are killing fish, killing birds, maybe poisoning people who are using the water downstream, maybe taking a river that used to be good to swim in, but now we can't swim in it. So these are all real costs that are not reflected by the price of the object in the marketplace. And so that's a market failure. And this has been known for a long time. It was first discussed by an economist named Arthur Pigou in the early 20th century. And Pigou said there's a solution. The solution is a tax. We put a tax on the object to cover those external costs, and then we can use the money to clean up the river, and also that the tax is a disincentive for the person to do the pollution. So Pigou had a solution to this problem 100 years ago. He wrote about this in the 1920s, and sometimes they're called Pigouvian taxes. And so you may know, and probably many people listening know, many people have suggested, including conservative economists, that the solution to climate change is a carbon tax. And it's not a radical idea. It's not even a left-wing idea. But the fossil fuel industry doesn't want that. Because if carbon costs more, then oil, gas, and coal costs more, and then people are incentivized to find and use a different product. And that's kind of the whole point. You want people to be incentivized to move away from the damaging thing and towards something less damaging. But if you're the manufacturer of that damaging thing, you don't want that. And so the fossil fuel industry, and not just the fossil fuel industry, but the pesticide industry, the chemical industry broadly, begins to push back against environmental regulation. And so in the late 60s, early 70s, there's a whole group of statutes that get passed: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Protection Act, bunch of things. These really create the framework of environmental protection in the United States post-1970 or so. And this is what Reagan begins to push back again. We see pushback in George H.W. Bush was kind of okay, but certainly in the George W. Bush administration. And now we're seeing a wholesale attack, not just on the statutes and regulations, but even on the EPA itself, in an attempt essentially to dismantle the EPA from within, with the firing of thousands of scientists and putting someone in charge of EPA who doesn't believe in the mission of the agency.
Yeah. So, thank you.
Yeah.
I know it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
We know that. So, here we have a difficult subject, which is that as we have this public conversation, and we have maybe disinformation of people saying things that they know isn't true, but in order to get their agenda forwarded. But what I see is that the people who want deregulation have a great deal of money. It's very profitable, and they want it to be even more profitable.
Right.
And the people who want regulation don't have a great deal of money.
Yes, that's true.
And we see that the money is incredibly influential in who is in government, what party is on top, or what politicians are on top.
Mm-hmm.
We see it manifests in all kinds of ways. It's being used to pay for journalism. It's being used to pay for academia. It's being used to pay for all kinds of ways.
Social media. Right. Yeah.
All kinds of ways of influencing us that are almost invisible.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't do it. When people talk about, I don't want the nanny state, I don't want the government telling me what I can eat.
Right.
And I go, don't you know that somebody is telling you what to eat?
Right.
And they're actually doing a pretty good job of it?
Right.
They're doing such a good job, you're not even aware of it.
Correct.
And they're telling you, and they're successful.
Right.
And you're eating this crap
Right.
because they told you this would be a good idea.
Right.
So, I know you're aware of this, and I'm just, as I think we probably have to move towards closure here. I know we talked about this earlier, that everybody always asks you, what can I do?
Yeah.
And you gave a beautiful answer, and it's not just personal, it's also what can my group do? What can we as a people do? And some of it is what can I as a person do?
Right.
So how do we stand up? We talked about David and Goliath, and it can be Davina and Goliath, but what do we do when we have just a little slingshot and a stone and we're up against a behemoth?
Yeah. Well, it's a really tough question, and I don't want to be one of those facile people who says, oh, don't worry, it'll all be fine, because I don't think it will all be fine. I think we need to be motivated to action, in part because unless we are motivated, it won't be fine. And I think every one of us has to get involved. I think sometimes people say, oh, I don't like politics, it's messy, it's ugly. And that's true, it is messy and it is ugly. But if we don't all get involved, then the big money forces win. Because they have all the money, but there are more of us. So it's not just David and Goliath, but it's also one Goliath and 330 million Davids. And I think that's really important to remember. There are always more of us than there are of them. And so that's why any answer has to be a both end. So I often get asked, what can I personally do as an individual? And one of the things I like to do there is to quote Bill McKibben, and says, don't try to solve this problem as an individual, because these are structural problems and we can't solve them on our own. I often say I can change my light bulbs, but I can't change my electricity grid. So we have to organize. We have to find common cause with people who share our values and concerns. So maybe it's organic food, maybe it's protecting winter sports against climate change, which is something I've been involved. Maybe it's local democracy, maybe it's voting rights broadly, maybe it's tax reform. Like, to find the angle that motivates you to get involved and to get involved. And especially, I think, the tax reform issue is really important, because it's a reminder that no matter what it is that gets your blood boiling, it is relevant. Because, you were just talking a moment about the big money and the influence of big money in power in politics. A lot of that has to do with our tax structure. When Dwight Eisenhower was president, the top marginal tax rate was 92%. imagine even having that conversation today, even with liberal Democrats, right? Now it's what, 35, 40, something like that. So part of the reason that money has so much power in this country is that we have allowed individuals to amass colossal, breathtaking, astonishing fortunes. I mean, $360 billion. What even is that? You can't even get your head around that, right? And, you know, even a person who had $30 million would be a colossally rich person. And now we have people who have, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so they can buy whole social media outlets. They can buy senators. They can change the outcomes of elections because they have so much money. So one thing we desperately need to do in this country is to work for reform of the tax system and to roll it back to something more like what it was before, because so much of the income inequality in this country, which translates to political inequality, is because of our tax system. And it doesn't have to be that way. It wasn't that way before, and it was different in the past. It could be different again in the future. So we have to think about those structural aspects. But at the same time, that's a long game. I mean, I feel like one of the lessons of our work is that we look at the amount of time that these business leaders worked to develop their arguments, to cultivate the University of Chicago, to cultivate Ronald Reagan, to get him elected. I mean, it was decades of work, and they were patient, and they didn't give up. So it means we have to be patient too, and that's hard. So we also have to think about what we can do in the short run, and that's where the individual piece comes in. And so I think it is important for individuals, for us all to think, well, what can I do in my own life so I don't feel depressed, or so I feel like I'm at least taking arms against the sea of troubles. And so then food becomes really, really important, because food is an area where we have a lot of agency. Most of us are able to make choices about our food. I mean, not everyone, and some people have more choices available than others. And because grocery stores, supermarkets do respond to consumer demand. I mean, I worked with Robbie Kenner when we made the film version of Merchants of Doubt, and his previous film was Food Inc., which was a very influential film, did very well. It actually was a commercial success, earned some money for Robbie, which was great. And studies they did afterwards showed that it affected people's thinking about food. And there's a great scene in that film where people from Walmart are discussing the decision to sell organic yogurt at Walmart. And I can't remember if this is in the film or if this is something that Robbie told me that they said after the fact, but the guy said, yeah, we didn't give a shit about organic food, but our customers wanted it. So, you know, consumer demand can make a difference, and it makes a difference to your own health when you eat better food. So you're doing something positive for the planet, but also positive for yourself, and that's an area where you have agency. And, you know, I focus mostly on climate change. The carbon footprint of beef is 60 times the carbon footprint of lettuce. Now, obviously, we're not going to live only on lettuce, but it's like 30 times the carbon footprint of eggs. So we have lots of good food available to us, food that tastes good and is healthy and nutritious, and we don't have to eat food that is destroying the planet and bad for our health as well. Or we don't have to eat it very often. And I always like to say this too. I'm not telling you, I would never tell someone never eat a hamburger. If you like hamburgers, you could eat a hamburger from time to time. You could have a steak from time to time, but just think of them as things that have a heavy carbon footprint. So just like getting on an airplane has a heavy carbon footprint, using AI has a heavy carbon footprint, using a lot of air conditioning. These are all things you can do if you have to, but think about it first and think about, well, maybe I don't need to use air conditioning. Maybe I could actually just open my windows at night, which is what we do. Cool down the house at night, close the windows in the morning. You'd be amazed how much you can cut your energy bill just by opening and closing windows.
Yeah. All right.
And sometimes we don't do these things just because we don't think of it. And that's where conversations like this are so important, to remind people, you know, sometimes it's easy to feel powerless in the face of our political structures. But on the other hand, every one of us can open and close windows.
That's right.
Both
Naomi.
literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, thank you, Naomi. Look, I just want to say one of the things that happens is that we get hypnotized. We get overwhelmed.
We do.
We face it, and it's overwhelming for all of us, for everybody.
Yeah.
And we go, you know, it's so hard to succeed. And yet, as you say, there are places where we can, for sure. And also, I would say that when we can get together to do it, it's pretty fun.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And that's
Yeah.
why it's so important, again, not to try to do this on your own, but to find the people with whom you have common cause, the people who share your concerns and values, and work together with those people.
That's right. All right, Naomi Oreskes, thank you so much. And
You're
I
welcome.
did want to call out Robbie's film version of Merchants of Doubt, which Claudia and I watched, and it was just fantastic. So
Thank you.
there are these great books, and there's also this great movie, and thank you so much for your work.
I always say I'm a lucky academic because I can say, if you don't want to read the book, you can always watch the movie.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. If you have a spare minute today, the single most effective way you can help us grow this movement and others to find this podcast is by leaving us a rating and a review wherever you listen to our podcast. You can find a video version of this interview on our website or on our YouTube channel, and you can join us every Sunday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. And if you haven't already, please sign up for our weekly newsletter at realorganicproject.org/email. See you next time.